Are there further amendments? Yes, gentlemen.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman
Serving
from
the right
Indiana.
to object.
The clerk will report the amendment by Mr. Boyer.
It's not an amendment of an amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Boyer. At the end of Section 3102, add the following new subsection.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady from Colorado has reserved a point of order. Gentlemen, Mr. Boyer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the amendment which I sought to offer that was ruled out of order as a third-degree amendment. I brought it back because I want to build off of the work of Mr. Stupak and build off of his logic. And I concur with his logic with regard to when the map, when the broadband inventory map is released, the definitions would then be revised. It only makes sense then that the allocations are then thereby revised. So I want to build off of the intent and the spirit of Mr. Stupak, and I believe this follows good logic. I also believe that this amendment then brings congruence to Mr. Markey's amendment, because Mr. Markey's amendment that was just now adopted is incongruent with what is existing in the allocation, saying that 75% is going to go to underserved and only 25% to those who are not served at all. Now, he just asked us, and the committee adopted his national broadband plan that under paragraph B says the contents of the plan shall seek to ensure that all people of the United States have access to broadband capability and shall establish benchmarks for meeting that goal. Yet in the base bill, there are allocations that are incongruent to this. So what I hope we're doing here is I want to make a correction of this incongruence. I want to couple exactly what Mr. Markey has done with his national broadband plan, and I also want to build off of the good work of Mr. Stupak. And I would ask the committee to adopt this amendment to revise the allocations based on the data used by the NTIA to develop and maintain such map. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his
Chairman,
time.
I withdraw my reservation.
The gentlelady from Colorado withdraws her reservation. Further discussion, Mr. Stupak?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the spirit in which Mr. Boyer offers this amendment. And I said before, I'm not sure if 75-25 is proper, 80-20 is proper, but I think we're just down the road a little bit too much here, and until we have the folks in the room who knows who put together these numbers, I'm not willing to start changing allocations. We forget in this argument that when I look at it, I think, well, fairness to rural areas make out pretty well, whether you're served, unserved, underserved, we make out pretty well. Put that with the Farm Bill, which we just tightened up the requirements of the Rural Utility Service program. I think all of America will be well served. So I'm, without knowing more information, I'm not inclined to start changing formulas on it. This was put together, again, by the House, the Senate, and the current administration, and I just don't think we should be going down this road. I appreciate what Steve's trying to do, and until we get this mapping done, I don't think we should be changing around numbers.
The gentleman
we
yield.
don't know why we're changing, other than we don't like the formula. Yes.
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to embrace your argument, Mr. Stupak. I don't know what the formula should be either. And if we don't know, then let's don't lock ourselves in onto a 75-25. That's my only point.
Sure.
So I embrace your logic.
And I agree with you, but we argue with NTIA on the coupon program for the DTV, and now we're going to have to change it because good suggestions made by members of Congress on both sides, they just simply ignored. So I'd rather go with the base bill as written as to bring NTIA in here again, and they'll say, oh, everything's wonderful, and we'll have a disaster 30 days later with their numbers. So I understand what you're doing. I appreciate it, and maybe we ought to look at this a little bit more.
Sure. Gentleman yield?
Sure.
Let's say we find ourselves now down the road. We have the map. We understand that this allocation will not achieve the goals as Mr. Markey has just asked for from the FCC to ensure that all people in the United States have access to broadband capability. So if the map comes back and we say, you know what, we really messed up. This allocation will not be able to achieve a national goal. Would you be willing to work with the committee here to change the allocation?
And if that's the situation, I'd be willing to work with you, and I know Mr. Markey would hold hearings to make sure he got it right. And so I'm confident. Let's leave it like it is. If we have that problem, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. Mr. Markey, once you.
I thank the gentleman. And we don't think this solves the problem. We just honestly believe this is a down payment on solving the problem. So we'll be revisiting this issue in the years ahead. There's no question about that. So I think that Mr. Stupak has expressed correctly the reasons why there's a balance in this bill the way it is right now, and we can come back as a committee and revisit it in another year to make our own determinations, but we should be the ones making the determinations in that area. So I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Well, thank you. And I know I said Mr. Markey would hold hearings. I guess it would be Mr. Boucher. But knowing Mr. Markey, he would claim it's global warming, and he'd grab jurisdiction and try to have a hearing on it anyways. So with that, I yield back.
Chairman of the full committee will keep that from happening. Any further discussion?
Yes, move to strike the last word.
Who is seeking recognition? Yes, Gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would support the amendment. You know, I look at this bill and I look at how we are delegating the FCC the authority to write these definitions that I believe we don't have the ability to write because we don't have the information to write them right now, or we would write them. And we tell the FCC you got to do it in 45 days. And then we tell NTIA, do your mapping, report to the FCC, and FCC, after you get that report in 3 months, come back and alter your definitions of underserved to comply with whatever NTIA tells you. Meanwhile, we've allocated as a aspirational goal 75% of the money to the underserved and 25% to the unserved of $3 billion. We're doing all this in 2 hours' time here. And then I'm hearing, well, in the years ahead, we'll take a look at all this and see how we did. And I was told, and maybe somebody can help me with this, that right now the federal government's spending about $13 million on broadband build-out. Is that accurate? Anybody know how much we're spending this fiscal year? Maybe I direct to council. You don't keep track of that. Does anybody on the committee know how much we're spending in this country right now on broadband build-out?
Broadband altogether?
Well, okay.
We don't have a
I'm
federal
told by an appropriator it was 13 million.
No.
Million with an M. And we're going to spend $3 billion in this committee and $3 billion more, $2.885 billion more in the Ag Committee on broadband build-out with definitions we refuse to write that we delegate to an agency to do and then to revise after the states have submitted their applications. If we think the coupon program is a mess, wait until this gets done.
Any further discussion of the Markey Amendment? Who is seeking recognition?
It's a Booyer amendment.
Yes, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask to strike the last word.
Oh.
Well, what the Boyer,
We're on the Boyer Amendment, I'm sorry.
what the Boyer amendment is asking is to add another variable to the process. In my opinion, if the geography of the maps of the underserved and non-served is done well enough, we won't need another variable. So I'd ask the gentleman to consider waiting until the maps have been drawn, and if they're drawn properly, the underserved and unserved will be allocated properly without having to go through another variable change. From my experience, trying to manage two variables at once on something as undefined and as squishy as this is going to make the problem more difficult and more intractable. Yes.
That's what this amendment is trying to accomplish. What Mr. Stupak has done is he's basically said, let's don't let the FCC make these definitions. Let's go to the map, and the map will help us define what the underserved and unserved areas are. I'm just saying once that map defines them, shouldn't that then be the basis of the allocation, not just us here being capricious and arbitrary and saying, well, let's do a 75-25 without really knowing what the map's going to be. So that's my intent of the map. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you.
Amendment.
It's just that if they have the solidity of a 75% allocation already given, then they'll know how to decide the unserved and the underserved without having to add another variable to the whole process. And that just makes, in my opinion, adds to the confusion of of trying to get things done in a way that is well-defined and respected by all the parties. I yield.
Gentleman yields back his time. Further discussion? If not, we'll, yes, Mr. Barton.
Right, just briefly, I can't answer Mr. Waldron's question what the government has spent, but the private sector has spent on broadband deployment in the neighborhood of $500 billion to $1 trillion over the last 10 years.
Are we ready for the question? All those in favor of the Boyer amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Do you really want one?
You don't have to say please. If you want it, you get it.
Clerk will call the roll.
Sorry. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Oh, I'm sorry. He voted aye. My apologies. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo. No. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak.
No.
Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel.
No.
Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green.
No.
Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. No. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. No. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez.
No.
Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Not recorded. Mr. Weiner? No. Votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. No. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. No. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrich. Mr. Gingrich, aye. Mrs. Scalise. Mrs. Scalise, aye.
Members wish to be recorded. Mr. Hall, how do you vote?
Mr. Hall is not recorded. Mr. Hall votes aye.
Mr. Whitmer.
Mr. Pallone.
Votes no.
Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Welch, I'm sorry. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no.
Mr. Barton? Mr.
Gordon votes no.
Have all members responded to the roll? If so, Mr. Blunt? Yes. Mr. Blunt votes aye.
Mr. Blunt votes aye.
Clerk will tabulate the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 21 and the nays were 33.
21 ayes, 33 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.